When thinking about cell membranes and permeability, we have to first think about a couple key functions of what a cell membrane does before we get started. First of all, a cell membrane helps hold the cell together. Obviously, things that are inside of the cell, all of those organelles, need to be kept in place. Number two, helps retain the shape. We know that animal cells are generally round or spherical. We know that plant cells are generally rectangular. So we want to make sure that those shapes are retained. And the third thing, and this is going to be the focus of what we talk about today, is controlling the passage of materials in and out of the cell. Obviously, there are certain things that the cell needs, and there are certain things that the cell wants to get rid of. And through today's class or lesson, that's what we're going to discuss. When discussing cell membranes and the types or designs of these cell membranes, we have three main types: impermeable, semi-permeable, and permeable. Impermeable, and if we take a look at those first two letters, IM, basically mean that nothing or no things are allowed through. We can think of this like being a wall. So if we have our impermeable membrane, what we're looking at, and again, imagine we could do this in a magnified view, is we might have things or parts of our cell that are very, very tightly closely woven together. And if we have items that are trying to pass through, let's say we have something that is about that shape and or size, obviously it makes sense that that is not going to be allowed through that cell membrane if we have an impermeable membrane. The second type that we can have is semi-permeable. And again, semi refers to some. This we can think of kind of like a door. If we have a cell membrane that is semi-permeable, we will have some spaces in our cell membrane where, depending on the shape and size of the item, those shapes and those items may be allowed through if they can fit through that door. So if, for example, I had something that was this size in this shape, obviously it can fit through that small space. If that same item were to land over here, obviously it's going to get caught up on that cell membrane and it's not going to be allowed through. If I had something that was a different shape and size, let's say I had something that was like this, obviously it can definitely not fit through that cell membrane that is selectively permeable, because based on the shape, the size, and the direction that it's hitting that cell membrane, it is not going to be allowed through. Lastly, we have permeable, and this is basically telling us that anything can get through, and we can think of this as being, let's say, our outdoor yard. So if we go out to our schoolyard and we take a walk around, we can go anywhere we want, and it doesn't matter the shape, the size of the object, it can go where it freely wants. So in actuality, there are not very many cell membranes that are completely permeable. What we're going to focus on are cell membranes that are semi-permeable. Take a second and try and think of a couple examples of something that is impermeable and something that is semi-permeable. A couple everyday items that we can relate to impermeable and semi-permeable membranes are the following. With impermeable, we can think of something like a plastic water bottle. Obviously, you put the water in, and as long as the lid is on tight, the water is not allowed to escape. The parts of the water bottle are too close together and the water cannot fit through. Something like a raincoat. Obviously, it's a rainy day, you want to keep yourself dry. So, again, the fibers or the parts of that raincoat are so tight together that the rain cannot get through. Lastly, something like a window, or specifically the glass in a window. That glass is obviously letting through things like sunshine, but it's not going to let through something like the wind or the rain. It cannot get through. If we think of semi-permeable membranes, so these are things that, given the right size and shape and direction, certain things can get through and certain things cannot. We might have something like a strainer or a colander. So if I'm making something like pasta or rice, the water can filter through to drain out, but the rice or pasta is going to stay inside of the strainer or the colander. Something like a Brita filter, if you've used one of those. The water is allowed to pass through, but the filter is going to catch all the little impurities that you don't want to drink. And lastly, if you think of a window again, but this time you think of the screen. Obviously the screen will allow things like the wind to come through on a nice, warm, breezy day, but it will keep out things like flies, bugs, leaves. So that would be an example of some impermeable and semi-permeable real-life examples. Now, when we think about cells in particular and their permeability, we know that most cells are semi-permeable. Therefore, certain things they need to allow in and certain things they need to allow out or keep out. So, some things that cells, whether it's a plant cell or an animal cell, need to make sure that they allow in are things like oxygen. Obviously, that is needed for the cell to be able to do its thing. We also need water for certain cellular processes. And the last kind of key thing that we'll need are nutrients. Obviously, our mitochondria are going to need to use those nutrients to help create energy. Now, some things that the cell wants to either get out once it's used up certain products or keep out might include things like CO2. Obviously, once the oxygen is used up inside of our cells, we need to get rid of that waste. Second thing is physical waste. So once the water and the nutrients have been used, we do need to make sure that the cell can get rid of those things as well. And the last thing, this is more of something it wants to keep out, might be something like bacteria. Obviously, if bacteria gets into the cells, that can create a problem for the cell. And that's what we're going to focus on the next little part on the back of our page. All right, what we have here is a simplified view, very, very simplified view of what an animal cell may look like. We know this is an animal cell because we have that general round or circular or spherical shape. And what I've just done is created a small legend down the side of some things that our cell wants to be able to get in or get out, or in some cases keep out. And the other thing I've just added, just so that we can get a sense of why this and how this might work, is our nucleus. Obviously, our nucleus is a key component to any cell, and particularly our animal cells. So we can see that based on the size and shape of our nucleus, and based on the size and shape of our little spaces or our little pores that we have for things to get in and out of our cell, there's no way that that nucleus is going to get out unless there is significant damage to the cell membrane. So if I have something like water, obviously, if that water droplet or that water molecule hits the cell in the right location, and obviously it is the right shape and size in order to get in, it's going to be allowed passage into the cell. This is good for the cell because obviously the cell is going to need water. If over here, let's say we have a little bit of food or nutrition, and again, based on the fact that that little nugget of food or nutrition hits the cell membrane in the right spot and it's directed the correct way, it again is going to be allowed passage into the cell. This is again good for the cell because it's something that the cell needs to use. If I have something like a little molecule of oxygen, again, given the fact that it can access in through that doorway, access through that cell membrane, it's going to be allowed to get into the cell. Now, obviously, once the cell has used those things, oxygen, food, and water, one of the key things that is going to be created is some type of waste. So we might have waste, and this is going to be created by organelles inside of the cell. So this is convenient because it's going to make sure that those little packets that it's going to get rid of can fit out of those doorways, but it's going to be allowed to get out of that doorway. Now, the key thing to remember is these doorways are not only one-way doors, they are two-way doors. So if our cell needs to get rid of a little bit of waste down here, obviously it can use that same doorway to get that little bit of waste out of as it did to get that little bit of food into. Maybe not at the same time, but again, it will be able to get out. Next, if I have some carbon dioxide, so the cell has used, it's going to be allowed out, and again, it might actually go out of another doorway. So again, assuming it fits, that cell can get rid of that little bit of carbon dioxide. Now, the one thing that our cells definitely want to keep out is something like bacteria. So if we have something, let's say bacteria, that is shaped like so, kind of like a really oversized triangle, we can see that based on that shape and that size, the bacteria is not going to be allowed into that doorway. It might get partway in, but it's not going to be able to get all the way in, and therefore it's not going to be able to harm the cell. So this is kind of a key thing in the way that cells are designed. Now, one last thing, obviously we have millions and millions and in fact billions of cells in our body. So if we had, let's say, a little food molecule over here, and it happened to not line up nicely with the door, that's no problem. All it's going to do is bounce off that cell membrane, and it might find another cell opening or another cell spacing where it can fit in another spot. Now, the last key concept that we have to consider or think about are these two ideas of what is called osmosis and what is called diffusion. Now, I'm actually not going to give you the answers for these. You're going to have to take a look at chapter 1.3 in your textbook and try and determine for yourself what the difference between osmosis and diffusion is. Don't worry though, answers will be provided later in the week so that you can be sure that you are clear with your understanding.